Hello, everyone, and welcome to Samantha Politics, a show where we talk about global politics and women's rights. We have a great show coming up.
On the military for the genocide against the Rohingya. So
as these poor people are being attacked, people are hiding in their offices. You guys saw a guest.
We're going to be talking about Burma and Russia today, but just a quick U.S. Native American Secretary of the Interior. Now, this is really monumental because
I'm Samantha Caroline, your host of Samantha Politics, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hello, everyone. We are live with this week's episode of Samantha Politics. I'm your host, Samantha Caroline, and this is your source to learn about global news in a deep way with amazing women guests. I'm really excited about today's episode, which is going to be focusing on historic protests that have been happening in Cuba for the first time in 60 years. We have two amazing guests waiting in the wings for us. Ileana Fuentes, who is a prolific author and feminist critic of Cuba. She also came from Cuba when she was a child. And we also have Dr. Caroline McCulloch, who did her dissertation on Cuba. I'm super excited to have them both. But before we get to Cuba, let's go over some other global news updates. So let's talk about South Africa for 1 second. South Africa is experiencing its worst wave of violence in years. 72 people at least have already been killed. Soldiers and police are struggling to restore order in South Africa, and there have been more soldiers and police that have been recently deployed. It started when the former South African president, Jacob Zuma, who was being held on charges of corruption, but then refused to basically talk about those charges of corruption. And so he was actually in contempt of court, and he finally turned himself in, and he's now serving a 15-month jail term for contempt of court. So the protest started with Zuma's supporters protesting his arrest, but then it turned much, much larger than that. And it seems as if it's really this cauldron of anger for the inequality and the poverty that has plagued South Africa since the end of apartheid. Now, it's been almost 27 years since apartheid, and half of the population lives below the poverty line. Obviously, things have been exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic, with now 32.6% people unemployed in the first part of 2021. A third of the country is unemployed. People are saying that they're looting because they're stealing food for their families because they don't have enough to live, which is incredibly sad. It doesn't make looting okay, but it's just an incredibly sad fact that they don't have proper things in order to live. South Africa also is currently in the middle of a third wave of COVID-19 infections. In America, I think a lot of us have finally breathed a sigh of relief because our vaccination rate is so high and it's so available here. But we have to continually remember that it just isn't like that in the rest of the world. Only 2.5% of its 60 million people have been vaccinated against COVID-19. So think about that. Almost 98% have not been vaccinated. So many people are still getting sick and dying. It's also really disrupting the hospital system, which is not very good. It's running out of oxygen and drugs. A lot of those are imported through Durban, as well as food, the whole national hospital network. Now, protests have spiraled, as I mentioned, into a wide-scale looting spree. So, Zach, can you just take a look at that video for us? Wow, pretty unbelievable watching that scene of a shopping mall just being completely devastated by looters. More than 600 stores have been looted, and shopping malls and warehouses have not only been looted, but also set on fire. So, South Africa is in the middle of really devastating situation right now, and next week's episode is actually going to focus on South Africa, but I did want to give you that update today. Now, the UN and Syria. So, Russia was planning to block a UN Security Council resolution vote, or UN Security Council vote to deliver aid cross border from Turkey to Syria. And finally, Russia said a day before the vote was scheduled to happen that they would, in fact, allow it. The mandate was set to expire on July 10th, and they did, in fact, decide to vote in favor of allowing aid into Syria. Syria is also in an incredibly bad state. They've been in war for almost a decade now, and the situation is really dire there. And the lack of humanitarian aid would have led to massive amounts of starvation and even more death, which is, startling. And you can see why Russia would not want aid, because Russia are the ones who have been helping Assad to barrel bomb and kill his own people this entire time. But the ethics of just starving a population out from a lack of aid is just horrific. So people are saying that it had to do with the Biden-Putin summit. I'm not really sure that was the case. I love our president, but I'm not sure that he necessarily was the reason behind that. I think it's more Putin's own calculations of what he would look like if he did allow that Russia vote to block aid to Syria. Texas. So the Texas thing would be funny if it wasn't so pathetic and depressing. That Texas, I'm laughing. Texas Democrats actually fled the state. They fled the state. They got on a plane in Austin, Texas, and they landed in Arlington, Virginia, which is a hop, skipping away from where I am right now in Washington, D.C. Why? Because it was literally the only thing that they could do to stop Texas Republicans from voting on this bevy of horrendous laws that majorly restrict voting rights in Texas, including in many communities of color. So the only thing they could do was to literally flee. The governor Abbott is now saying that when they come back, they're going to be arrested. And I thought this was also hilarious. Imprisoned within the state chambers until the vote has been made. I don't know if he's going to shackle them to their desks or what exactly he's going to do or think he's going to do. And they've also come here to talk to our federal Congress and to say, can you please pass some federal laws on voting rights so that we don't have to literally get on a plane and escape to blue territory in order to stop the Texas Republicans from passing these draconian and frankly racist laws. So that's happening within domestic news. Last week we covered Haiti, and which was really fascinating, thinking about it was basically a whodunit of who was responsible for murdering the Haitian president, Jovenel Moise. And it's still not figured out. Still totally unclear who did it. There's a little bit more kind of clarity around it. Police have issued warrants for 5 fugitives, including former Haitian Senator John Joel Joseph, ex-government official Joseph Felix Badio, and businessman Rodolphe Jarre. There was a little bit of a mystery, which was very interesting last week, of talking about how the people who went in and murdered him were speaking Spanish, and what was that about? Where did they come from? Well, it looks like it had to do with Colombia. So the authorities have also arrested 18 Colombians and 3 Haitians, including 2 that were dual U.S. Haitian nationals. So there's going to be there's also an alleged mastermind, a U.S.-based Haitian doctor named Christian Emmanuel Sanon. Supposedly, his intention was to take over as president of the republic, but it's still kind of unclear if that was the motive. There's still a lot of kind of mud and cloud around this. Also, Haiti called for America to come to its aid and said, please come help us come help to restore order in Haiti. They are really in this power vacuum and not in a good place. So I'm pretty sure the U.S. has kind of always jumped to Haiti's aid, that we will go there and try to help restore order. But is that a long-term solution? No. In terms of Haiti, I think that the U.S. government needs to place a much higher premium on working with not just the Haitian government, since the Haitian government has been completely dismantled by the former president, besides the prime minister, but really focus on working with Haitian civil society groups, including women, to try to come up with an infrastructure for this country that works for everyone and that helps everyone to prosper, not just helps the rich to become richer. And including women in that process, I think, is really, really critical to Haiti developing a sustainable government infrastructure. And a vibrant civil society always is key to a government maintaining itself. All right, so we're going to move on to the topic of our show, Cuba. But before we get to Cuba, I just want to say that a thank you to our sponsors, Stream Inspectors, all the pretty graphics. Whenever I say, hey, Zach, can you put up that video? Zach is the CEO of Stream Inspectors. They are the experts in live stream production, and they do this show for us every week pro bono. They're amazing. I love them. I'm so grateful for them. If you have live stream production needs, please go look at Stream Inspectors. Our other sponsor is an amazing psychologist who's been in practice for almost 40 years. Now, depression and anxiety have increased markedly since we were hit with COVID, and stress levels have increased as people try to function in a more unpredictable world. Chronic stress, depression, and anxiety have been implicated in heart attacks, strokes, and even dementia. That's why it's so important to start taking care of your mental health. We have a mental health crisis in this country. Dr. Helene Carlin has been specializing in helping people take care of themselves for years. She's trained in the latest psychological understanding of how to take care of your mental health. And she also offers telehealth sessions. So a lot of her patients see her via telehealth. So we're going to put the phone number to reach her at, but it's 203-746-2436. And we're going to put the link in the chat as well of drhelenecarlin.com. And I will post that, or have our intern post that in the chat. So definitely go see her if you need help or just need someone to talk to. And lastly, our other sponsor is my company, Empower Global. We do diversity and inclusion training. This morning, I spent training a bunch of finance professionals on inclusive leadership. The afternoon, I talked to a tech company where I'm designing a workshop on anti-Semitism for them to help people gain awareness of anti-Semitism. We do a lot of different types of workshops. We also host a women's leadership challenge, which is for women around the world to step into their power, build community with one another, and smash the patriarchy. So again, we'll put a link into the chat to Empower Global as well, but it's empowerglobal.net. All right, so on to the topic of our show, Cuba. So Cuban citizens, as I mentioned, are protesting for the first time in more than 60 years. There has been deteriorating living conditions, a lack of basic goods and services, and people are calling for the end of this 62-year-old communist regime that doesn't seem to really give a hoot about the people and just about maintaining power. The classic machismo government. We need to just get rid of all of these governments. I'm gonna take Ileana's book about ending machismo government in Cuba, and I'm going to turn it into just ending machismo government everywhere. Thanks for your inspiration, Ileana. So President Miguel Diaz-Canel, who was elected in 2019, has deployed security forces across the country. Protesters have been attacked. At least 80 have been arrested. One person died on Monday, and a lot of people have been hurt. Now, the situation in Cuba is dire, and that is why so many people are coming out into the streets. There's daily blackouts, which also means that the refrigeration goes off. So if there's food in the fridge and there's already a food shortage, then that food goes bad. There's a lack of fuel. There's medical shortages, and they're having a COVID crisis right now because they reopened tourism too soon, and tourists have been coming, and Ileana is going to highlight this more for us. Tourists have been coming from Russia, workers have been coming from India, and there's been a huge spike in COVID cases, but the hospitals don't have oxygens. They're they don't have any of the medical supplies of COVID patients. And it was bad before that. There were already medical shortages. There's a restricted potable water, a terrible public transportation system. Lots of buildings and houses are just collapsing due to lack of construction materials and neglect, while fancy hotels are being built in the tourist areas with lots of beautiful construction equipment. There's a deteriorating sewage system, dilapidated hospitals, absence of state-produced pharmaceuticals, Ileana described this actually beautifully in an article she wrote, potholes on every street and rotting garbage in every corner. So I want you to imagine that. One beautiful thing we have in America, that usually there's no garbage on the street, right? Like we take that for granted that people come to clean up the garbage. It's not like that in every country. Now, with the COVID crisis, there weren't as many cases in 2020, and now they're having almost 6,000 cases of COVID in a day in a country of only 11 million people. That's a staggering amount of COVID cases, between 50 and 60 people dying a day, and that's just estimates. So Cuba has notoriously been anti-human rights, the anti-free speech. They've always detained, fined, and harassed critics. From January through August 2020, according to Human Rights Watch, there were 1,028 arbitrary detentions of people. The government also controls the media. So they control the messaging and they really restrict access to outside information. According to a 2019 Committee to Protect Journalists report, Cuba has the most restricted climate for the press in the Americas. Authorities also creepily detain scores of people to prevent them from coming out to protest, even sitting outside their homes to tell them not to attend a protest, or arresting them midway to a protest. So the fact that people did come out and protest is historic, as we said. All right, so that's my spiel. Now I'm going to bring in the real experts to give us the lowdown. Ileana Fuentes holds a BA in history from Fordham University and has done graduate work in women's studies at Rutgers University. She is a published author and has lectured and written extensively on Cuban emigre culture and on gender in Cuba. Presently, she is a guest opinion columnist for CubaNet News. She was born in 1948 in Havana and came over in the Operation Peter Pan, as a child, and she wrote about that in her memoir, Portrait of Wendy, a memoir. Other books she has, she's so prolific, I can't even read out all her books. Outside Cuba, Contemporary Visual Artists, Dengue, the Secret Epidemic of Fidel Castro, and Cuba Without Strongmen. And she has 2 new books coming out, Canales Historias That Are Not Forgotten, and Portrait of Wendy, and then another book that her and I were just talking about that's not even on this bio. So Ileana, bienvenidos a Samantha Politics.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone.
I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm just so honored that I have you on the show. I'm going to bring in our next guest as well. Dr. Caroline McCulloch is a Cuba specialist with academic and professional experience in foreign affairs. She recently earned her PhD in international relations at Florida International University with a graduate certificate from FIU's Latin American and Caribbean Studies Department. Her dissertation explored Cuban American influence on U.S. foreign policy, where she interviewed dozens of high-profile members of the Cuban American community, conducted focus groups, and researched decades of archives. She's interned with the Office of the Coordinator for Cuban Affairs of the State Department and has presented her research on Cuba at the International Studies Association, Harvard, and the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. Welcome to the show, Caroline.
Hi, thank you for having me.
All right, ladies. So what are your perspectives on what's at the heart of the Cuban protests that are happening?
What's at the heart of the protests is 60 years of shortages, abuse, persecution, lack of freedom, lack of human rights, lack of civil rights as we know them, as any civilized country knows them. Total control by the Cuban Communist Party, which is under the Constitution, the only political party that is allowed in Cuba. So you have to abide by what the Central Committee of the Communist Party orders. In the Constitution, it says that communism, Marxism, socialism, whatever you want to call it, I think it says socialism, is irrevocable. So it's eternal, it's forever, for life. And Cubans are tired of having no choices, of having no food, of having, as you mentioned before, no running water, no reliable electricity, no freedom to move, even from one place to the other within the country, because everyone is assigned an identification card, a ration card, literally, and to the pharmacy, a pharmacy card, and you cannot move from where you are living. You're registered there, and if you were, for example, if this was Florida and you wanted to move to Georgia, you can't, because you won't have registration in Georgia. So that becomes even more serious when you have women who are victims of domestic violence, even women who divorce their abusive husbands, and the husband cannot be made to move out of the house because he is registered in that house and has a right to be there, even though he's been beating his wife for years. So there are no shelters. Women have no shelters. There are no official. There's only one.
And Ileana, I wanted to just to preface this by saying that the rates of femicide, which is the murder of women, and domestic violence have sharply risen during COVID. So to frame that, and then you were saying, so say again, so you're saying that there's no domestic violence shelters. That's unbelievable.
There are no women's shelters. Women, because of the pandemic, of course, and this is worldwide, but it's been very real in Cuba. The isolation, the distance, the social distancing, makes people stay indoors and at home, and that has increased the rate of domestic violence and femicides, because women have nowhere to go but hell, literally. And so,
wow, nowhere to go but hell. That's pretty profound,
that
Ileana.
is how it is. As we were talking before, this wave of protests, although many people are saying that are inspired by the song Patria y Vida, Homeland and Life, which has revolutionized the way people look at their lot in life in Cuba and their possibilities. So the song has been an inspiration to people, but the physical start of these protests happened about 3 weeks ago, when women in the vicinity, in the neighborhood of El Cerro, in Havana, decided to go out into the middle of the street and protest, and brought their furniture out, their refrigerators. They lined them across the street from one sidewalk to the other to block traffic. The police came, the security agents came. It was a riot. There was no violence, but the women just stood there in the middle of the street, sitting on their chairs or their sofas or whatever, with their refrigerators next to them, in protest for the living conditions, for the conditions of housing, which are dismal, the conditions of food shortages, of medical shortages, and everything else that we were talking about before. So this whole crisis, this whole protest has a lot to do with the lives that women have been forced to endure for decades. So it's come to the point where they say, I've had it. No more.
Basta.
That's it.
Enough.
Se acabó, which is what the song Patria Vida says.
Oh, they're saying se acabó.
It's over. And it is. It is over. What the government is going to do about the protest.
So, Ileana, I'm going to stop you there. I just want to hear, does Caroline have any perspective on kind of what the, the build up to these protests are?
Yeah, I actually, there's a number of things that I've kind of identified as leading up to this, because really the question is, why now? If this has been going on for 60 years, what is it that makes this the moment that all of this happened? So some of those things, some of what has led up to this has been Venezuela's economic collapse. Cuba was largely dependent, or the government's funding was in many ways dependent on Cuban oil Venezuelan oil subsidies that were donated to them in exchange for doctors, and so on, through Petrocaribe, which also relates to Haiti, since that is going on at the moment right now. Then there's the changing leadership in Cuba. As you mentioned earlier, Diaz-Canel became president of Cuba, I believe, in 2018, after decades of leadership from the Castros. Raul Castro only became president officially in 2018, or 2008, excuse me. He started acting as president in 2006. Then you have the Trump administration changes to policy, which tightened up the embargo a little bit more, made it more difficult to send remittances, made it more difficult to travel, which affected the small private businesses that were starting to kind of establish themselves in Cuba. You have in the year, a couple months after Diaz-Canel took over, he instituted Decree 349, which really, it placed greater restrictions on Cuban artists. So it inhibited freedom of artistic expression. So Cuban artists have really been the leaders of a lot of this change in the past few years.
Can I just stop you there 1 second,
Yeah,
Caroline?
sure.
So, Ileana, I know you are an artist and you've been behind the Cuban museum. Can you talk a little bit about that decree and the kind of the role of Cuban artists and how their role has been suppressed?
Well, I'm an art historian, and actually, yes, the last couple of years in particular, although this is not new, this goes back to 1961, the famous words to the intellectuals pronounced by Fidel Castro at a artist and intellectual congress in Havana, who dictated, he said, within the revolution, you can have all the rights. Outside of the revolution, you have no rights. And that's been true for the last 60 years, literally 61 to 2000.
Wait, so Ileana, does that mean like if you're within the communist whatever, it's okay, but if you're protesting against us, you're out?
Of course, but that's the whole nature of a totalitarian regime, and that's what you have in Havana. What you have in Havana is a totalitarian government with one party running the entire country, an obligatory allegiance to that party, and as Diaz-Canel said 2 days ago, and has been said ad nauseam, the streets belong to the revolutionaries, which means that if you're not in favor of the revolution or if you're a protester, the streets are not yours. The universities are not yours. The jobs are not yours. The vacations, the few vacations, are not yours. Nothing is yours. You're a pariah in your country. And that is probably, I don't know, 60, 70% of the population, which I knew, people who are in this field know, but to the average American or the average European, everything is hunky-dory in Cuba. People are so happy. Oh, they're so happy. The tourists come, we show them around, we dance around and we sing around and we have our mojitos and we talk about Ernest Hemingway, and this is paradise. Well, guess what? Sunday, July 11th showed the world that this is far from paradise. This is hell. Hell in the Caribbean. Hell in the tropics. And for women, it's bad for everyone. But for women, it's twice as bad because of all the limitations and all the responsibilities that are on the shoulders of Cuban women. The family, the children, the elders, income, the food, sanitation, hygiene, everything is on the shoulders of 6 million, 5.5 million Cuban women who have had it over here.
And you mentioned, Ileana, too, that with regards to women in one of your articles, I thought this was interesting, that the nutrient shortages have affected women more as
Well,
well,
of
because
course.
we get our periods and we need iron and
Exactly.
we have kids and we need
Exactly.
whatever, and so we can't access that.
Exactly. That's why, and elderly women as well, and maybe most of all, Cuba is going to be in the next 20 years. It used to be 20 years ago. They used to say in 40 years. So now I'm saying in 20 years, Cuba is going to be a country of old people. And we know that old people in the population above 60 or 65, there are more women than men because women live longer. So the social services tragedy that is upon us in Cuba, with such an elderly population that is malnourished, that has no access to good medicine or pharmaceuticals that will cure their ills, and there are many women. We get many different conditions. Men do too, but I'm talking about women. They're depleted. Their calcium is depleted. Their iron is depleted. We know we're not making this up. This is reality for women anywhere in the world. But in Cuba, with this situation for such a long time, for so many years, 60 years, what we are facing is a population in dire health needs. And nowhere in sight is there relief. I don't see that.
And given precedents with the 1994 Balseros, the rafters, people who came over en masse, during kind of similar conditions, really, in the special period, and in 1980 with the Mariel boat lift and so on, really with a lot of these, you see young men being the ones who come over more often, not that women don't, but it's most likely it's younger men who are the ones who are making these trips.
There's a sexist explanation, and it is that when you take to the seas on a boat or on a raft, men don't want to bring women because women could have their periods and the blood could attract the sharks.
Wow.
So therefore, and this is a reality. That's why there are more rafters. When you see a raft coming in with 20 people, you see one woman, two women, and the rest are young men.
You'll also see women staying in Cuba to watch over the kids.
Exactly, and of course the kids will come. So, but this is part of the culture. This is part of the idiosyncrasy. Women can bleed at any time. You don't know when you're going to get your period, and if that happens on a raft, the population of sharks in the Strait of Florida is all going to come to see us. So therefore, and people talk about this. People who have come in rafts talk about this. Very few cases where women have come with their husbands or their boyfriends or their children on a raft to the United States. So the whole picture for women, no matter how you slice it, even the best intentioned Cuban man will say, oh yeah, women will bleed. Oh, they're dangerous. No. We don't want a woman on the raft. Maybe we'll go, and 3 years later, we'll file for her to come to the United States, and who knows what happens then. I know what happens then, but whatever. But not on the raft. Thank you very much. And that is a reality. That is a reality.
So fascinating, Ileana. And in humanitarian situations, also when food is given out, women are always the last to eat. So the man eats first, then the little boy, then the little girl, then the woman.
Exactly.
Which is also something to keep in mind.
The other thing with Cuba is that humanitarian aid comes in, and the government is the one that does the inventory, receives the merchandise or the medicine or whatever, and distributes it according to its priorities. Then you'll see it in the foreigners only pharmacies. And you'll see it in the foreigners only shops, and you say, "What? This was donated humanitarian aid." Well, it doesn't necessarily reach the people who need it, and it might reach the people in Havana and nearby Havana, but all the way out in the east, in Oriente Province, which is the poorest and blackest province of Cuba, or group of provinces in Cuba, the stuff doesn't get there. The stuff doesn't get there. What's happening right now when in Matanzas and Cárdenas, which are 2-3 hours away from Havana, east of Havana, the hospitals have collapsed. That's where the tourism hub is in Varadero, in the Varadero Resort. And so between the Russian tourists who have been coming in since the 1st of April at a rate of 3,000 per week,
wow,
and the construction, which hasn't stopped, there's no tourism, but the construction of hotels with combined Cuban and foreign money keeps going on. They're being built. Well, they're being built by Indian workers because the companies feel foreign workers, in this case it's Indian workers, are more reliable because they don't have shortages at home or the roof falling on their heads to incentivize them to steal materials. So that already happened at the Kempinski Hotel in Havana, 5-star luxury, obscenely luxurious hotel that fired all the Cuban technicians and workers to bring in a squadron of Indian workers who got paid, normal international wages, which Cubans are not paid that, but they were the ones who finished the hotel because the building company, the construction company, which was the investors' company, did not trust the Cuban workers. So now with the variant, with the Delta variant of COVID and the Russian tourists coming in, the whole Matanzas area, Matanzas Cárdenas, which is where all those tourism spots are, and there's also in Holguín, which is further east, and it's the same situation. Cases of COVID have spiked tremendously, and there's a resurge of the virus that was sort of under control. And as you said before, 6,000 deaths on an 11 million people population, and 50 or 60 deaths per day. That is unacceptable.
Staggering.
If you'll allow me to just offer one thing that I've been seeing as correct information that's been going around regarding the embargo and the pandemic, because a lot of people are blaming, the United States. It's because they can't get the resources they need in order to address it. There's some truth to that. But since the 1990s, Cuba, it's actually been legal for the United States to send medical supplies to Cuba. However, because of the embargo restrictions and some of the paperwork and or red tape, right? It makes it very difficult to get it there. I don't know why they are unable to secure it from China or Canada or,
Russia, frankly. Russia is the one giving the COVID.
I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
Because the machistas in power want to prove to the world that Cuba is a medical powerhouse. And so they're producing their own, they've produced their own vaccines. They have 2, Abdala and Soberana 1. And they are, with no data and with no trial periods, the way we do things in the industrial world, in Europe and even in Latin America, they've put out the vaccine. They've sold millions of vaccines to Venezuela and to Nicaragua, their friends and their pals. And about 11 million, let's say 6 million adults in Cuba, only about 1 million people have been vaccinated with the Cuban vaccine. So clearly, it's not that the United States cannot sell or even gift vaccines to Cuba. The Cuban government has said, no, we don't want your humanitarian help. The same way in 2008, the 3 hurricanes that hit Cuba, I was running a women's democracy program giving assistance to women in Cuba and helping them with self-employment development. Out of Miami, and we had We had aid that we could send to the people who had been hurt by the 3 hurricanes in a row. And the Cuban government said, no, we don't want any. We don't need your humanitarian aid. You know what you can do with it. And so it's not the first time that Cuba says no to humanitarian aid. And right now they're saying no. And that's another reason why people who know but let's make it clear. Technology has made possible for these protests to occur. Why? Because up to maybe 5-6 years ago, people didn't have phones and cameras in their phones and internet and Facebook and everything else and Twitter and all of that. They didn't have that. But today they do. Today something happens in Oriente and 2 seconds later in Australia, they're already seeing the event and knowing about it and hearing about it. So the technology, the information technology, the communications technology has made it possible for people to be protesters and witnesses to whatever else is happening. And it's not like before when people, sort of gathered and, complained and etc. There were no telephones. There was no internet. Today, there is.
Right. It makes such a huge difference, I think, for organizing, not just in Cuba, but everywhere that we're seeing. Exactly. And Caroline, what's your perspective on the impact of social media and technology on, kind of organizing?
So I think beyond just, organizing, obviously, that's been an impact all over the world, in the United States, outside of the United States. It had an impact on the Arab Spring. It's just been able to help people communicate, especially in a place like Cuba, where it's been for decades very hard for people to meet together without it being kind of found out and things being broken up before things can even really get started. But beyond that, so with that, it's notable that internet access is still not great on the island. Not everybody has access to the internet. So Cubans have found other ways to spread their information digitally with Bluetooth apps and flash drives and so on. But a major impact of this is that the information is getting off the island and beyond the barriers that the government has been able to place to prevent information from leaving the island, to prevent information from entering the island. It's been really hard for them to have such a tight grip on this.
And I think, what's interesting, Caroline, is this is, Zach mentioned before, this is my 31st episode of Samantha Politics, and I've covered so many countries now. And in so many of these countries, this is the problem with these machismos holding on to power, is that people are finding other ways to distribute information. Iran shuts down, control state media. Well, guess what? They're doing stuff on Clubhouse. Russia, controls state media. Well, guess what? They're doing things through Telegram and organizing protests for Navalny on Telegram. New tech things will just continue to pop up. I mean, it's so interesting through Bluetooth and flash drives. But I think that, fingers crossed, inshallah, as much as we're seeing a rise of populism and authoritarianism, what I'm seeing is it's getting harder and harder for them to really hold on to power, because people have more access to information, to organizing power, to new ideas, and that's not going to go away. That's just going to continue to, proliferate. But
I want to add that when you declare that a telephone, that a mobile telephone is a criminal object, it's the tenets of the owning of a telephone to photograph an event or just to talk to anybody, but you can use it also to photograph what's happening, an event. That has become a crime. That is a crime against national security, what the Cuban government calls national security. So, and this is what what Caroline was talking about, Decree 349 and Decree 370 are all about. We're talking about 5-6 year prison sentences for reporting. For example, right now, from Sunday's protests, Camila Acosta, who is an independent journalist, and
a Spanish journalist, right?
A colleague of mine in Cubanet has been arrested, and she is facing probably 3 or 4 years of jail. And there are other women who are jailed or who are under house arrest or who are constantly harassed. And of course, the nature of a totalitarian government, and to illustrate what we were talking about before, is that by the push of a button, the entire internet connection disappears in 2 seconds in the whole island, which is what has happened since Sunday. Today, reports were out that it had been restored in certain areas. But the people who will report and who are activists have their houses surrounded under surveillance by state security or by the national police. So it's and a lot of those activists are women, brave women who are risking everything, their lives, their careers, their tranquility, their peace of mind, the safety of their children. They're doing their bit for this.
Unbelievable.
If you don't mind me bringing up one of the conversations we were having when we were preparing for this, I think it's really also interesting and important to bring out the fact that since we brought up the San Isidro movement, these artists that were at the forefront of this, the people who are really at the head of this, in addition to a lot of them being women, a lot of them are black and brown women, black and brown men. If you watch the video for Patria y Vida, which is a play on words, right? It means homeland and life.
We'll post that in the chat for people so they can see that YouTube video, because we can't stream it here for copyright reasons. But yeah, go ahead.
But it's a play on words with the communist slogan, homeland or death. So it's homeland and life, right? But the artists you see that, they're black and brown artists in Cuba. And I think Ileana had some really interesting things that she probably wanted to say about that as well.
Absolutely. The situation is that about 40% of the population of Cuba, 45% of the population of Cuba is black and brown, black or brown. And with the exception of one member of the Communist Party Central Committee and the government, one out of 20 in the Central Committee, the rest are white men, and many of them are very old white men. So they look at black Cubans and they literally say, ese negro.
He's black.
He's black. Who cares? Who is he? What rights does he think he has? We made this revolution for them, for the blacks. Now they are so ungrateful to us, as if, literally, and people will say, why, how could you be against the revolution? We took you down, the revolution took you down from the trees, which, what that means, the comparison, because there is such racism in Cuban culture. And this is not, I know that this is not a discussion about race, but the face, and this is what Caroline was referring to, the face of the Cuban peaceful opposition today is black, brown, and female. There are a number of white, or that appear to be white, opposition leaders, and they have just as hard a time and are as persecuted and as harassed as the next guy. But if you are black or brown, if you are an activist, you are an ungrateful SOB, a traitor to your country. So you keep your mouth shut, because, on top of everything, I'm going to be a traitor and an ungrateful SOB? No, I'll shut up.
And notably as well, there's also been the protests in the past couple of years for LGBT rights in Cuba.
I want to stop for 1 second because we actually didn't air any of the footage of the protests, and we have a few videos that Ileana provided for us. So Zach, let's just play both of those videos of the protests so we can see what's going on in Cuba. Ileana, can you describe for us what's going on in those videos?
The first video, I don't know exactly in what location it is, if it's in San Antonio de los Baños, whatever town it is at, the people are throwing things, rocks probably, and just, bundles at the police. And you can see the police cars, the white cars, retreating. And some of the police that are on foot running away from the crowd. And the crowd is yelling, "Turn around, turn around. We are after you. Turn around." And they keep running, of course.
So they're yelling, because I thought they were yelling, "Cuídate." What are they yelling?
They're yelling, "Vírate. Vírate, turn around. Come back.
Interesting.
Don't run away from me, come back.
Come face us.
Come face us." Exactly.
Interesting.
And the other group is at the Havana Harbor. At Havana Harbor, go from Havana mainland to the other side where the beaches are. You either go by road, or there was, when I was a kid, I was a little, not a little girl, but I was about 10, there was a tunnel built from one side to the other, El Túnel de la Habana, which is, it was built in 1959, 58, before the revolution. And it still, obviously still works, good construction. And people gathered there. And you saw there had to be 500 people coming into the El Túnel. And they're also screaming, yelling the same type of, and they're actually saying, "There's a lot of people here. A lot of people are coming. Boy, I didn't think there'd be so many people." They're commenting to each other. In most of the videos that have come out, you see people yelling, "Freedom! We want freedom! We want food! We don't want any more lies. We're not afraid anymore." Because that song "Patria y Vida" says, "No more lies. You've been at it for 60 years. We will not listen to any of your, slogans. No more lies. We're no longer afraid." There's a great article in the New York Times from today or yesterday that says, titled, "The Day That Cubans Lost Their Fear."
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah, that's very powerful.
And I think there, Ileana, I've worked with activists from a number of countries, and I've been working on this book on Syria with a Syrian activist who's a photojournalist through the whole crisis. And he talks about, in this book that I edited, that at first he was scared, and then he stopped being scared. And then once he stopped being scared, you couldn't put him back into the fear box. That all of these people, once they came out and they exercised their voices and they realized that they deserved freedom just as much as any other human being, you could not put them back where they were, into their cage. Like, it had been unleashed. And so I think that's what's so powerful about this, is you can't then say, "Okay, well, go be scared again." No, like, they're saying, "We're not scared anymore." And that's what the power of a movement.
The late novelist Reinaldo Arenas used to say that the government has such power over you, the Cuban government has such power over you, that it can send you to school and it can send you to the firing squad. It can educate you and kill you.
Wow.
And this is a very impactful reality. If you, as a person, you're born there, or you were 10 years old like I was when these people came to power, and your whole life is controlled and programmed by the element of fear, You have to do this because you lose your job. You have to do this because you'll be thrown from the university. You'll be expelled from the university because the universities too are for the revolutionaries. So you grow up and you become an adult and you go on through your life being afraid of breathing because you're afraid that somebody will misinterpret how you're breathing or what you're saying.
You even see that among people who've left Cuba.
Exactly.
People are still afraid to speak.
Exactly. So for people to say, and I also think you're afraid when you're alone, but having this phone and being able to communicate and show what's happening, you know you're not alone. So that is
So
also
powerful. You know you're not alone.
Yeah, that's it. So you are able to resist, and you are able to press. You're able to overcome your fear. Fear, real fear. 20 years in jail, 25 years in jail.
Yeah.
It's not a joke. This is real fear. What if I am arrested and then I'll never see my children again, or I won't see them for 10 years, both men and women? There were 7,000 women in political prisoners in Cuba in the 1960s. 6,000 plus Cuban women political prisoners. That is medieval.
Unreal.
That is medieval. That is taking us back to the Inquisition.
And we have a comment from an audience member that I think is really interesting. That thanks, Adriana, for this comment. That people would whisper and or make gestures to refer to government figures, like touching your chin, to refer to Fidel Castro, to avoid fascinating systems of communication that were not using language.
Yeah, they would do this.
Wow. So that's his beard?
Yeah.
So interesting.
Well, how would you know that's him rather than the rest of the Barbudos?
Well, because you wouldn't refer to any of the other Barbudos. You'd be referring to, the commander-in-chief.
The main one.
Yeah. So I have a few more questions for you all, but we're running low on time. I feel like I could talk to you forever. What do you think that, Caroline, from a foreign policy perspective, what should the U.S. or the Biden administration be thinking about in terms of how do we help Cuba? It seems like the Biden administration has said that Cuba is not their foreign policy or LatAm priority. I think because of the issues at the border, they're focusing their LatAm priority on Honduras and Mexico and reducing violence there to stop the rush to the border. What are your thoughts?
So one thing that's notable is that there are a lot of Cubans and Venezuelans at the border. That they are not immune from this whole situation, even though we don't really think of them being the ones crossing the Mexican border. But that up until recently, when there's been more rafters again, the main way that Cubans have entered the U.S. has been through the Mexican border. Yeah. But regarding what the U.S. should do, I think one thing to put in perspective is that one way to look at Cuban history, the history of the Cuban people, is as a history of a struggle for them to be able to govern themselves in their own way. It was the struggle like that under the Spanish. It was a struggle like that even in the Republic, when the U.S. had the Platt Amendment, which allowed the U.S. to intervene on its own terms, with under dictatorships in Cuba, even during the Republican era, and then again under Fidel Castro and the Communist Party. It's been just a constant struggle of patriotism, of wanting self-determination, essentially, and continually being denied that. So one thing that the U.S. has to be considerate about is when acting, you don't want to appear or that the U.S. is trying to take over the country again, trying to run it. You don't want to do that, and you don't want to even give them the fodder to make that argument, because as soon as the government can say, hey, we're the ones protecting you from the United States and the Cuban exiles, which they tend to use to drum up fear, we're the ones protecting you from them coming in and claiming their property again, from taking over the country. when they can drum up that fear again, as if there's an actual threat of the US coming in, then they are able to use that fear to gain more power again, to entrench themselves. They've done it over and over again. So I guess I better make this quicker. So the US, the best thing that they can do was really probably loosen up restrictions that allow people to send remittances and aid to the people on the island, to their families, to the protesters who, by just virtue of participating in these protests, not only are risking their lives, risking going to jail, but risking losing their jobs, and being dependent on government salaries, being dependent on the government for their jobs. They're risking a lot, and also putting potentially their families in danger. So,
Ileana, what do you think that the U.S. government can do?
I'd like to clarify that
Sure.
that remittances have always been sent. Maybe there was a cap on the amount for a while, for a few years. The problem with the suspension of the remittances is that the government pulled out every dollar bill there was in Cuba. This was a month ago. Pulled out every US dollar that there was in circulation in Cuba, told people to go to the bank, to the central bank, because there was only one bank, the central bank, and deposit their dollars in their account in the bank, which belongs to the government, the bank. And from a certain date, I think it was the following Monday, Cubans could no longer have US currency or use it anywhere. So the economy, the government has dollarized the economy. There are items available at certain stores that you can only purchase. They're called hard currency stores, hard currency only stores. You can only pay with dollar bills, with dollars. So, but if you cannot get the dollars, you cannot buy there. And if you go with your Cuban pesos, which is the only currency that Cuban citizens, the Cuban population can use now to purchase what they need, if you go to the stores where you can buy only with Cuban pesos, there's nothing to buy. There's no fruit, there's no vegetables, there's no detergent, there's no soap.
So you have to have these US dollars.
So, and the reason why the Cuban government took this measure was to make sure that it could gather first, and no one else, the dollar remittances that were coming into the country. So the United States said, no. Where is that money going? It's going to the central bank, which is managed by the army. It's managed by Gaesa, which is the hotel, major hotel developer in Cuba, which is a state. It belongs to the army. It belongs to the armed forces. Imagine all the hotels in the United States being built by the Defense Department.
Wow,
it's absurd. And these people all have their money stashed away. All this leadership has their monies. This is a mafia. They have their money stashed away in heaven, in havens, in dollar, whatever they're called, abroad, in safe havens. So Cubans now, when families send a remittance to Cuba, to their relative in Cuba, they have to, if they send it in US dollars, it goes straight into it always goes straight into the central bank. It's not like Western Union is managing this money. That's no such thing. They're taking the money and giving Cubans the equivalent of Cuban pesos.
Wow.
Which are worthless. It's like monopoly money. They're worthless.
Wow. So they're just pulling in a crappy exchange rate.
Exactly.
Wow.
So these are all the things that unfortunately have to be considered.
There's been various ways that historically people have gotten aid and money to their families, including essentially people taking it in their luggage across the...
Which they can't anymore, because if you end up with American cash in Cuba because some relative brought it in hidden and managed to give it to you, you can't use it anywhere.
Yeah.
You are in the illegal possession of American currency.
Wow.
Which only the central bank, controlled by the army, can have. Why? Because they need to pay their debts. And you can't pay the debts, the foreign debt, to every country in the world, Europe, Latin America, Asia. You can't pay that in Cuban pesos because Cuban pesos are worthless.
And I believe what she's kind of referring to is getting rid of the dual currency system as well. So even when it wasn't, specifically dollars that are used, they had the convertible peso, which is what people who aren't Cuban use in Cuba.
Right.
But by getting rid of that exacerbated the economic problems in Cuba and caused this extreme inflation. So
I see. All right. So I have two more questions for you all, and then we're going to have to call it a night. Ileana, I want to quote you from a piece that you wrote that was very startling to me, and so I want to question you about it. You say, elderly Cuban today barely make do while pretending to be proud of their granddaughters for generating foreign currency through prostitution, especially with hard currency carrying foreigners. These young women are hailed as neighborhood heroines. Mariela Castro Espin, Raul Castro's daughter, has stated publicly that prostitution is a good profession. She points to sex workers in Amsterdam as an inspiring model. Fidel Castro himself, years before decrepitude set in, hailed Cuban prostitutes, jineteras, as the most educated prostitutes in the world. Is prostitution a huge profession? I mean,
It is what it is. It is what it is, and the fantasy that Cuba used to be, the prostitution capital of the Caribbean before the revolution, and that disappeared, obviously is a big lie, is one of the many big lies and big myths about this revolution. Yes, when a young woman, because obviously a 40, 50-year-old woman is not going to go into prostitution. When a young woman in a neighborhood or in a building goes into prostitution and uses her house to meet with the foreigners who will pay her $20, pittance, but $20 to spend the night, or $150 or $200 or euros, because now it can't be dollars. Now it's going to be for Canadian dollars. This is a whole new scenario. It's got to be either Canadian dollars or euros, because if you give a prostitute, a jinetera, $20, what is she going to do with it? She can't go and deposit it in the bank. Well, she has to. She can't use it. She has to, and she'll get, the equivalent in Cuban pesos. But up to a year ago, 2 years ago, if a young woman in the neighborhood was a successful prostitute, and young women in Cuba, I worked together in the feminist project in Cuba with a former lawyer and judge who used to tell me how these young women, if they were brought to court for any reason, accused of prostitution, they would argue, I am not a prostitute. I don't go to bed with Cuban men. I'm not a prostitute. I am a jinetera. I only go to bed with foreigners. So how warped does the mind of a human being become after you condition it to believe that that's what
so that prostitution's okay if it occurs with foreigners?
Exactly. So if a young woman was successful in the neighborhood or in the building, with having clients or having a steady boyfriend, a steady Italian, or a steady Spanish or French or Mexican from wherever, that came to Cuba twice a year or 3 times a year, and then every time he came, he spent 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, gave her money, gave her dollars, gave her goods, gave her items, gave her clothes, all kinds of things. This was the heroine of the neighborhood, because she was, and using a Cuban word that means solving, resolver. Jineteras were the women in the neighborhood for their families that were solving the economic problems.
Wow.
Resolviendo, going to bed or turning tricks or whatever with foreigners. Of course, that threw Cuban men into, chaos, because a Cuban man who didn't have dollars was worthless.
Hmm.
So how a general economic situation and a profession that is the oldest in the world, they say, it's the oldest trade in the world, how it affects even the psyche of its people. Men felt worthless. I can't take this girl out because I don't have US dollars or euros or Canadian dollars that she can profit from with me. I have Cuban pesos or cooks. Worthless. So
But what about the impact on the psyche of young women of thinking that prostitution is the best, if everyone's, it reminds me of kind of young men that want to become gang members in certain places because they have all the power.
I wrote an article years ago about this problem and quoted, interviewed a mother-daughter family. The mother was a university professor at the University of Havana, and she made something like, at that time, we're talking about easily 12 years ago, 13 years ago, the mother was making $250 equivalent dollars a month as a college professor. And the daughter, who was like 17 or 18, said, "Mom, I make that in over a weekend. You're a loser." Those are when people talk about reconstructing Cuba, and I'm sure Carolyn has heard this, when people talking about rebuilding Cuba, many people are very worried that it's not just the physical that has to be rebuilt, but the value system.
Wow.
That has to be brought back from wherever it's gone.
Wow.
It's very sad. And of course, I'm going to close by saying, do the machos in power care? Of course they don't care. The more money, the more tourists looking for jineteras that come to Cuba,
The better.
The better. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Last question for you all is that there's a perception that Biden lost the election because all of the Cubans in Florida voted for Trump. And that's apparently not true, but that was the word on the street. So I would love if you could just correct that myth.
Okay. So I have a lengthy dissertation that kind of addresses that, but some of the things to know, there is some truth to that, because Miami-Dade in Florida was one of the biggest places where there had been the most movement from Democrat to Republican. That's kind of undeniable. And some of that has to do with kind of the old radio stations that have always been a big part of Miami culture. They're Spanish radio stations that have been really a part of the Cuban, or just like an intrinsic part of Miami Cuban culture, right? But then there's also these new YouTube stations and kind of celebrities like Alex Otaola and all, who are speaking to this younger generation, but also speaking to a lot of the newer immigrants from Cuba. At the same time, you see a whole lot of demographic shifts in the Cuban population. You have third generation Cubans who are voting. You have newer immigrants who, unlike a lot of the older migrants, still have family and friends back in Cuba. So they have different, they tend to have different ideas about what sort of connections should still be allowed between the United States and Cuba, and allowed for Cuban Americans specifically when it comes to travel and so on. So a lot of them really supported Obama with some of the inroads he made. And age is a factor. Generally, the older Cuban Americans tend to be more conservative than younger, but that's not exclusive. Cubans in general tend to be more conservative than most Latino populations, which obviously in the U.S., which obviously are very distinct depending on where they're from and their background.
Did all of this messaging, Caroline?
Uh-huh.
What they're saying is that all of this messaging about Biden being socialist, the Democrats being socialist or communist, make inroads with the that I don't know that we're going to turn America, if Biden gets elected, into communist Cuba. I mean, is that perception accurate?
Yes, honestly, yes. I believe that is one of
that
has been a very effective message.
That rang familiar with a lot of older Cuban Americans. I confess, I am a registered Democrat and have been for the last 30 years of my life since I was in New Jersey. And before that, I was an independent. So about 48% of Cuban Americans in South Florida today are Democrats. Daniela Levine Cava, who was elected as mayor of Miami-Dade County, is a Democrat who defeated Carlos Jimenez, who's a Republican. Of course, you can also say that Carlos Jimenez defeated. Who did he defeat? I forget who.
Shalala? No, it was.
No, that was Maria Elvira Salazar.
Debbie Mercado.
So Republicans. I don't remember the name, but
I think it's Debbie Mercado Powell. Something like that.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes, they were Democrats. Shalala and this other lady were Democrats. And
Hillary won Miami.
They were unseated. Hillary won Miami.
Obama won Miami.
So I voted obviously for Obama. I made my poor mother, God rest her soul, who was a registered Republican, not go to the primary, and convinced her that she should also vote for Obama. And she said, I like this guy. She died shortly after. But anyway, it's not what the media continues to harp on and portray. Things have changed a lot.
Absolutely.
Older Cuban Americans hold a grudge for the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which, of course, they rest on the lap of John F. Kennedy. I myself put it on the lap of General Eisenhower, who was a Republican and an army man, and created a blunder with such a plan.
And Reagan really brought a lot of them to the Republican Party.
A lot of those Cubans, back. Reagan, of course, it was under Reagan in 1985 that Radio Marti was approved, which was necessary to get some information, just like Voice of America carries information to the whole world about the world and about the United States. Cuba, of course, with all news outlets barred from Cuba, with only one official press corps, which is all the government, Radio Marti and then later TV Marti was very much needed. That was the time when the war in Angola was going on, and the Cuban people needed to know where their young black sons were being sent to what war, in what godforsaken country they were being sent to fight some Cuban-related war, which of course Angola had nothing to do with Cuba. But anyway, be that as it may, yes, the Republican Party, Cubans are traditionally very progressive, very social-oriented people. The labor unions in Cuba, the Communist Party in Cuba used to be legal during Batista. And
Ileana Ros-Lehtinen is an example of that too. Like she was, in certain ways, she advocated for LGBTQ rights and for immigration and everything.
So there's been a lot of evolution, but there is a fixation on the Cuban American community of Miami being, reactionary, conservative, and illogical. And that's no longer true.
Yeah, and And even then, like the newer waves of migrants are different from the oldest waves of migrants. So they come with their own different opinions and experiences. Ultimately, what it comes down to is, I think, yes, the socialism kind of boogeyman message was effective, but that doesn't mean that Cubans are going to be I can't think of the word, just continue to completely identify, not that they ever fully did, but to be identified with the Republican Party.
And as I always say to my Republican Cuban American friends, I say, and where were the Republican presidents of the last 60 years? Where were they when they came to do something to unseat the communist regime in Cuba? Because they didn't do any better than the Democrats. So tell me, what is this?
And if anything, Biden loosened up restrictions so that there could be some income coming into Cuba.
Biden is totally aware. Biden is one of the most intelligent, brilliant, and in foreign relations top statesmen that we luckily can count on. Biden knows exactly how Raul Castro duped, or apparently duped, Barack Obama.
And he was in charge of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for years.
Right. All right. I'm going to end on one last question. I thought that was my last question, but I have one more. This is mainly for Ileana. And this is just because I teach a feminist leadership class where I talk on and on with my ladies about why we need feminist forms of leadership and government and foreign policy. And your book, Cuba Sin Codillos, Cuba Without Strongmen, also envisions kind of feminist governance as a way forward in Cuba. So I would love to just hear, what does that mean to you? What does that look like? And why do you think that that's the way forward for Cuba?
Well, the patriarchy has screwed up so many countries and so many national agendas. And in Cuba, it's been men, more patriarchy. And women have always been second in importance. Women had the vote, won the vote, suffrage in 1934, which was the same year that the Platt Amendment was revoked. It didn't last very long, 32 years, because Caroline mentioned it before. But women think more peacefully and more creatively, for whatever reason, because we are called to conserve humanity, conserve the children, take care of the elderly, plan the future. Women can do a better job, I am sure, than men have done, at least in Cuba, for the last 100 years. I have no doubt. Women have to build and not destroy. There's a book, an excellent feminist book titled Maternal Thinking. I forget the author. It's an American author. And she argues that women learn very early that they have to negotiate things. They have to negotiate human relations. If you beat a child because he or she doesn't eat or does something wrong when he's 5, then by the time he's 8, you're going to have to punch him. And by the time he's 12, you're going to have to torture him. And by the time he's 19, you're going to have to kill him. So women know that there are other ways of resolving conflict, or that other ways of resolving conflict have to be found. And I think women understand better. This has been proven the world over. Development programs, development monies that arrive in Africa or Asia or Latin America and go to the hands of women do achieve development projects. And in people's lives. This has been proven the world over. I'm not making this up. This is already true. When the money goes to the men, a good part of it ends up in the gambling and the women and the unnecessary expenditures. And where did the development go? Out the window. Women invest and use development money in their communities. And this has been proven the world over. So that's why I am convinced, I fully believe, that a government run by women, it could be 50-50, but run by women is a healthier government for the welfare of the people in that country.
All right. On that note, I think we're going to end. Love that point, that at least give women a try, because the men haven't been doing a very good job. You can say the same thing in Haiti of last week, where the parliament, the percentage of women in parliament is pathetic, and Haiti is a nightmare. It's a disarray. I mean, all these places that are in disarray have been run by these strong men, and it's time for the machismos, the codilleros, ¿cómo se dice? Codillos to go. Basta. I want to thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias. This was fascinating. I couldn't stop asking you questions. I know the audience, we have some bravos from the audience. Really, really interesting. And I'm so glad to bring this perspective on Cuba to the American people and to the broader global community. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, both of you.
Thank you.
It's been great.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been great, Samantha.
Thank you so much. Good night to you too.
Good night.
Good night.
Well, that was a terrific show. I apologize to the audience. We went a little long. I just couldn't stop asking questions. It's so interesting. I think it's so interesting too, because Cuba had a blackout for so long and didn't have internet and social media, and you get information from snippets from the person, like Ileana was saying, the person that comes back from Cuba with a picture of an old car and a cigar. And it's this very romanticized kind of 1950s, Cuban night smoking a cigar with a mojito, but that just totally washes over the political situation within the country. So this was my really first chance to deep dive into this. And so I hope it was as interesting for you as I know that it was for me, and to these amazing feminists that I brought on my show. A big thank you to Dr. McCulloch and to Ileana Fuentes, and I encourage you to check out their work. I also want to tell you that next week is going to be about South Africa. Next week's show is going to be on Thursday, July 22nd at 8 p.m. So be sure you tune in. We're going to be looking at the protests in South Africa, what's going on there, what is the future of equality, what's going to happen with Jacob Zuma. I also want to give a big thank you to our sponsors. Again, Stream Inspectors, the people who do the really cool graphics and the spinning globes around my head and all this kind of stuff. I don't know the first thing about that. I still draw stick figures. That is Zach and his team at Stream Inspectors. So I encourage you, if you need live production, go to Stream Inspectors. They are the best. Frankly, I've worked with other people and they had no idea what they were doing. And Stream Inspectors really does know what they're doing, and they are the leaders in live stream production. Also, a thank you to our sponsor, Dr. Helene Carlin. If there is a mental health crisis in this country, if you're suffering from anxiety, depression, go get help. You don't have to bear it alone. We have mental health care. She does do telehealth appointments on Zoom or Skype or whatever it is. So drhelenecarlin.com. Her website is in the chat. And also a thank you to my company for sponsoring this, which is Empower Global. The world has changed. Things have shifted. There's so many different populations. There's migrants. There's different people of different religions, especially in global companies. How do we all interact with each other? And as a specialist, as you can see in cross-cultural relations and diversity inclusion, me and my team facilitate really interactive, engaging workshops about really important issues that help people to open up in a non-political way. Don't worry, no politics involved, but in a non-political way to open up about these important issues and to relay some of their feelings and their experiences to other people so that we can get a better understanding of ourselves. And then we don't have to get trapped in this situation of political division and divisiveness and antipathy towards one another. So my website is in the chat, empowerglobal.net. We're also accepting applications for our Women's Leadership Challenge, which is a breakthrough program that helps women step into their power, gain community with other women, learn how to analyze power, deconstruct power, speak truth to power, and advance their own feminist change initiative to make the world a better and more gender equal place. There's only 8 spots per cohort, and I believe half of them are already gone for the cohort that's starting in August. So I encourage you to apply now. If you're interested, empowerglobal.net/new-online-challenge. That is it for this week's episode of Samantha Politics. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you for tuning in. If you liked this episode, share it on Facebook, share it on YouTube. The other thing I should mention is we have a Patreon. So if you like this content, if you think this is important, if you want to learn more about global issues in a deep way, if you want to see the feminist or the women's view on things, we have a Patreon. Our donation levels are as small as $3 a month, which is $48 a year, which is nothing. I feel like I could go out to dinner tonight and spend more than $50 on an appetizer and a tortilla or something like that. So encourage you to subscribe to our Patreon. I believe it's patreon.com/SamanthaPolitics1. We'll also be posting that in the chat. So please subscribe. Please consider becoming a member. You get special members perks like suggesting episode topics, a private chat community, etc. And that's it for tonight's episode of Samantha Politics. Thanks, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye, everyone.